I walked into my grandfather's cabin in the Montana wilderness, expecting dust and memories, but instead found a family of strangers eating breakfast at his handmade dining table. The woman holding a coffee mug in my grandfather's favorite chair looked at me like I was the intruder, and that's when I knew something had gone catastrophically wrong. "Excuse me, who the hell are you?" I demanded, my heart pounding as I took in the scene. There were kids' toys scattered across the floor, new curtains on the windows, and the smell of bacon filling the air. This was supposed to be my sanctuary, the place I'd inherited after Grandpa died 6 months ago. The man at the table stood up quickly, his face flushing red. "Who am I?" "Who are you? This is our property. We bought it fair and square." I felt my stomach drop. "Bought it? This cabin has been in my family for 40 years. I'm James Wheeler. My grandfather built this place with his own hands." The woman set down her mug and pulled out her phone. "I'm calling the police. We have the deed. We purchased this property legally at an HOA auction 3 weeks ago." "HOA auction? What HOA?" "This cabin isn't part of any HOA. It's on 5 acres of private land, completely separate from any development." My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what she was saying. Within 20 minutes, a sheriff's deputy arrived at the property. Deputy Morrison was a middle-aged man with tired eyes who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. He examined the paperwork both the family and I presented, his frown deepening with each document. "Mr. Wheeler, according to this deed, the Hendersons here purchased this property at a foreclosure auction conducted by the Pine Valley Homeowners Association. The sale was for unpaid HOA dues totaling $8,000. But there is no Pine Valley HOA connected to this property," I insisted, pulling out my grandfather's original deed from 1985. "Look at this. This land was purchased decades before any development existed within 10 miles of here. There's no covenant, no agreement, nothing that would make this property subject to an HOA." Deputy Morrison studied my documents carefully. "These folks have a bill of sale and a quitclaim deed signed by someone named Patricia Carmichael, president of the Pine Valley HOA board. But your deed does show this property predates any local HOA formation. So what happens now?" the husband, who'd introduced himself as Derek Henderson, asked nervously. "We paid $60,000 for this place. We have 3 kids. We sold our house in Billings to move here." "I suggest everyone lawyers up," Deputy Morrison said grimly. "This is way above my pay grade. Mr. Wheeler, you can't forcibly remove these people since they have documentation showing they purchased the property. But Hendersons, you might want to contact whoever sold you this place, because something isn't adding up." I left the cabin feeling like I'd been punched in the gut. My grandfather had left me that property specifically because he knew how much I loved it. Every summer of my childhood had been spent there, fishing in the creek, hiking the trails, learning to chop wood. And now some HOA I'd never heard of had apparently sold it out from under me. Back at my hotel in Missoula, I started making calls. The first was to my grandfather's estate attorney, Martin Bressler, who'd handled the probate. "James, slow down," Martin said after I'd explained the situation in a rapid-fire panic. "An HOA auction? That's impossible. I reviewed all the property documents when your grandfather passed. There was no HOA lien, no outstanding dues, nothing." "Well, someone named Patricia Carmichael seems to think otherwise. She's the president of something called Pine Valley HOA, and apparently she's been sending bills to the property." "To what address?" "Your grandfather's mailing address was his apartment in town. The cabin doesn't even have mail delivery. It's accessed by a Forest Service road." "That was a good question. I don't know, but I need to find out. Can you help me?" "I'll start pulling records first thing tomorrow morning." "In the meantime, see if you can locate this Patricia Carmichael and find out what documentation she has. Don't be confrontational, just gather information." The next morning, I drove to the address listed for the Pine Valley HOA office, which turned out to be a small strip mall on the outskirts of Missoula. The office was wedged between a nail salon and a tax preparation service, with a hand-painted sign that looked about as professional as a lemonade stand. I pushed open the door and found myself in a cramped room with filing cabinets lining the walls and a desk covered in papers. Behind the desk sat a woman in her mid-50s with an aggressively blonde bob haircut and reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. She looked up at me with the expression of someone perpetually annoyed by the existence of other people. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone suggesting she very much did not want to help me. "I'm looking for Patricia Carmichael. You found her. What do you want?" "My name is James Wheeler. I believe you recently conducted an auction for a property that belonged to my grandfather, Thomas Wheeler." "A cabin on Elkhorn Ridge Road." Patricia's expression shifted to something between defensive and smug. "Oh yes, the Wheeler property, delinquent account. We followed all proper procedures. The sale was completely legal." "How was my grandfather's property even part of your HOA?" "The cabin was built in 1985, decades before Pine Valley existed." She pulled a file from one of the cabinets with practiced efficiency. "In 2019, the Pine Valley development expanded to include all properties within a 2-mile radius of the main community. Your grandfather was sent multiple notices of the new covenants, conditions, and restrictions. He never responded, so his acceptance was assumed under Montana law." "That's not how Montana law works," I said, struggling to keep my voice level. "You can't just unilaterally add properties to an HOA. Property owners have to agree to covenant restrictions. There has to be a signature, a recorded document." Patricia smiled thinly. "The notices were sent certified mail. Non-response constitutes acceptance. Furthermore, your grandfather's property began incurring fees from the moment the expanded CCRs were filed with the county. By the time of his death, the account was significantly delinquent. As the inheritor, you assumed those debts. I never received any notice of these supposed debts. We sent notices to the property address. That's the address on file with the county assessor. The cabin doesn't have mail delivery. Any notices you sent there would have been returned or just sat in the woods. You had to know that." She shrugged, a gesture that made my blood boil. "Not our responsibility to track down property owners who don't maintain proper mailing addresses. We followed the law. We sent notices to the address of record. After appropriate waiting periods, we filed for foreclosure with the county. The sale was public, properly advertised, and legally conducted. If you have a problem with it, take it up with a judge." "I plan to," I said. "And when I do, I'm going to make sure everyone knows exactly how your organization operates." "Are you threatening me?" Patricia stood up, her hand moving toward her phone. "Because I can call the police right now for harassment. No threat, just a promise that this isn't over." I left the office before I said something I'd regret. Outside, I sat in my truck and called Martin back. "She's claiming they expanded the HOA boundaries in 2019 to include properties within a 2-mile radius, including Grandpa's cabin. She says notices were sent and non-response equals acceptance." Martin was quiet for a moment. "James, that's absolutely not legal. You cannot unilaterally impose HOA restrictions on existing properties. The owner must explicitly agree, and the agreement must be recorded. This sounds like a scam, possibly even fraud. I'm going to file an emergency motion to void the sale and restore your ownership. But you need to understand this could get expensive and take time." "I don't care about the cost. That cabin is all I have left of my grandfather. I'm not letting some small-time dictator steal it because she thinks she can." Over the next 2 weeks, Martin worked to build our case while I dug into Patricia Carmichael's background. What I found was disturbing. Patricia had been president of the Pine Valley HOA for 7 years, and during that time, there had been 6 other property foreclosures, all under similar circumstances. All the properties had been on the outskirts of the actual Pine Valley development, and all had been sold at auction for a fraction of their market value. I tracked down one of the previous victims, a retired school teacher named Dorothy Chen who'd lost a small lot she'd owned for investment purposes. They claimed I owed $12,000 in back dues and fines, Dorothy told me over coffee at a diner in Missoula. I bought that lot in 2010, years before Pine Valley even existed. Suddenly in 2020, I get a notice saying my property is subject to their HOA and I owe all this money. I thought it was a scam, so I ignored it. 6 months later, my property was auctioned off. Did you fight it? I consulted a lawyer, but he said it would cost more to fight than the lot was worth. I paid $18,000 for it. They sold it for $9,000 at auction. By the time I paid a lawyer, I'd be in the hole even if I won, so I walked away. I figured it was an expensive lesson about reading mail more carefully. She shook her head bitterly. But now I wonder how many others she did this to. At least 6 that I've found so far, I said. This is a pattern. She's systematically stealing properties. Can you prove it? I'm going to try. The emergency hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks after I first found the strangers in my cabin. Martin had filed a motion to void the sale and restore my ownership, arguing that the HOA had no legal authority over the property and that the foreclosure was fraudulent. I arrived at the courthouse in Missoula on a cold March morning, my stomach churning with anxiety. This hearing would determine whether I got my grandfather's cabin back or lost it forever. Patricia Carmichael arrived with her own attorney, a slick-looking man in an expensive suit who introduced himself as Bradley Winters. He looked extremely confident, which made me nervous. Judge Catherine Reeves was a stern woman in her early 60s who'd been on the bench for 20 years, according to Martin's research. She had a reputation for being fair but impatient with anyone who wasted her time. This is a motion to void a foreclosure sale, Judge Reeves began, looking at the paperwork in front of her. Mr. Bressler, you represent the plaintiff James Wheeler. Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Wheeler inherited a cabin from his grandfather, Thomas Wheeler, who purchased the property in 1985. The property has never been part of any homeowners association. 3 months ago, the Pine Valley HOA conducted a foreclosure auction claiming Mr. Wheeler owed $8,000 in unpaid HOA dues. This sale was completely illegal because the property was never subject to HOA authority. Mr. Winters, your response. Bradley Winters stood smoothly. Your Honor, Pine Valley HOA expanded its boundaries in 2019 in accordance with Montana law. Notices were sent to all affected property owners, including Thomas Wheeler. The notices clearly explained that properties within the expanded boundaries would be subject to the HOA's covenants, conditions, and restrictions. Mr. Wheeler never objected. After his death, his heir, James Wheeler, also failed to respond to notices. The HOA followed all proper procedures for foreclosure. The sale was public, properly advertised, and legally conducted. Your Honor, may I present evidence? Martin asked. Go ahead. Martin pulled out a stack of documents. This is the original deed for the Wheeler property, purchased in 1985, showing no HOA restrictions. This is the recorded plat for Pine Valley, filed in 2016, showing the development boundaries clearly excluding the Wheeler property. And this is the document Mr. Winters referenced, filed in 2019, claiming to expand the HOA boundaries. He handed copies to the judge and to Winters. Your Honor, if you examine this document, you'll see it was signed only by the HOA board members. There is no signature from Thomas Wheeler or any other affected property owner. Montana law is clear that HOA covenants must be voluntarily accepted by property owners. You cannot force existing properties into an HOA without explicit consent. Judge Reeves studied the documents carefully, her expression unreadable. Mr. Winters, where is Thomas Wheeler's signature agreeing to these restrictions? There is no signature, Your Honor, but Montana statute allows for constructive acceptance when proper notice is given and no objection is filed within the statutory period. What statute are you referring to? Winters cited a statute number. Judge Reeves typed something into her computer, Reed for a moment, then looked up with narrowed eyes. Mr. Winters, that statute applies to amendments of existing HOA agreements, not to the creation of new restrictions on previously unrestricted properties. Do you have any other legal basis for claiming the Wheeler property was subject to your client's authority? Winters' confidence seemed to falter slightly. Your Honor, the expansion was filed with the county and became part of the public record. All affected owners were notified. The lack of objection constitutes acceptance. That's not what the law says, Mr. Winters. Mr. Bressler, do you have evidence regarding the notice that was allegedly sent to Thomas Wheeler? Yes, Your Honor. Martin produced another document. According to the HOA's own records, they sent notices to the cabin's physical address on Elkhorn Ridge Road. However, that location has no mail service. The U.S. Postal Service confirms that address is undeliverable. Any mail sent there would have been returned to sender. Yet the HOA claims notice was properly given. Miss Carmichael, Judge Reeves addressed Patricia directly. Did you receive returned mail from the Wheeler property address? Patricia stood up, looking flustered. I don't recall, Your Honor. We send out hundreds of notices. Some are returned, some aren't. But you continued to claim the property was properly noticed despite knowing the address had no mail delivery. We used the address on the county records, Patricia said defensively. We're not required to investigate whether property owners actually receive mail at their listed addresses. Actually, Montana law requires reasonable efforts to provide notice in foreclosure proceedings. Sending mail to an address you know or should know is undeliverable doesn't constitute reasonable effort. Judge Reeves' tone was sharp. Mr. Bressler, do you have evidence that notice was not properly given to James Wheeler after he inherited the property? Yes, Your Honor. The estate was probated in January of this year. Mr. Wheeler's address was clearly listed in the public probate records. The HOA never sent any notice to that address. They continued sending mail to the undeliverable cabin address, then proceeded with foreclosure. Judge Reeves looked at Patricia and her attorney with obvious displeasure. So to summarize, the HOA unilaterally declared that an existing property was subject to its authority without obtaining the owner's consent. Sent notices to an address they knew or should have known was undeliverable. Ignored the publicly available probate records that would have given them the current owner's actual address. And then foreclosed on the property for non-payment of dues. The owner had no legal obligation to pay in the first place. Does that about sum it up? Winters opened his mouth, then closed it. Patricia looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. Your Honor, we followed standard procedures, Winters finally said weakly. Standard procedures that are apparently designed to deprive property owners of their rights, Judge Reeves said coldly. I'm granting the plaintiff's motion. The foreclosure sale is void. The property is restored to James Wheeler. Furthermore, I'm ordering Pine Valley HOA to pay Mr. Wheeler's attorney fees and court costs. Relief flooded through me so intensely I felt lightheaded, but Judge Reeves wasn't done. I'm also referring this matter to the county attorney for investigation of possible fraud. Miss Carmichael, I suggest you consult with your attorney about your potential criminal liability here. Patricia's face went white. As we left the courtroom, I heard her arguing with Winters in a harsh whisper. Outside, Martin shook my hand. Congratulations, you've got your cabin back. What happens now with the Hendersons, the family that bought it? They'll get their money back from the HOA. The sale was void, so they're entitled to a full refund. It's not their fault they got caught up in this. And what about the criminal investigation? That's out of our hands. But based on what we uncovered, Patricia Carmichael has been running this scheme for years. If the county attorney does their job, they'll find a lot more than just your case. I drove back to the cabin that afternoon with the judge's order in hand. The Hendersons were understandably upset when I explained the situation, but Derek seemed more angry at Patricia than at me. We gave her $60,000, he said, his voice shaking. We sold our house for this. Now you're telling us the whole thing was a scam. I'm sorry you got pulled into this. According to my lawyer, you can sue the HOA to get your money back, and honestly, you should. Patricia Carmichael has been doing this to people for years. Derek's wife, Amanda, was crying. Their kids were in the other room, oblivious to the drama. Where are we supposed to go? We don't have anywhere to live now. I felt terrible for them, even though none of this was my fault. I'll give you 2 weeks to find another place. I'm not trying to throw you out on the street. You're victims in this too. They packed up and left 3 days later, having found a rental in town. Derek told me they were joining the lawsuit against the HOA, and I told him I'd testify if needed. But the legal battle was far from over. The county attorney, a sharp woman named Lisa Navarro, launched a full investigation into Patricia Carmichael and the Pine Valley HOA. She subpoenaed records going back to when Patricia had taken over as president, and what she found was staggering. Lisa called me 6 weeks after the hearing. Mr. Wheeler, I wanted to update you on the investigation. We've identified 14 properties that were fraudulently foreclosed on using the same scheme Patricia Carmichael used against you. The total value of the stolen properties exceeds $2 million. Jesus. How did she get away with it for so long? Most of the victims didn't fight back. The properties were either small parcels of land or vacation cabins that people didn't use regularly. By the time they found out about the foreclosure, it seemed too expensive to fight. But we also found something else. Patricia was buying many of the foreclosed properties herself through shell companies. She'd auction them off for pennies on the dollar, buy them through an LLC, then resell them at market value. She's personally profited over $800,000 from this scheme. So it was never about HOA dues. It was just straight-up theft. Exactly. We're charging her with multiple counts of fraud, theft, and abuse of corporate authority. Each count carries up to 10 years in prison. She's looking at serious time if convicted. The trial began in September, nearly 6 months after I'd first walked into my cabin and found strangers eating breakfast. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. Lisa Navarro presented property records, forged documents, and financial statements showing how Patricia had systematically identified properties on the edges of Pine Valley's boundaries, fraudulently brought them under HOA authority, sent notices to undeliverable addresses, then foreclosed and bought them herself through shell companies. The defense tried to argue that Patricia had simply been overly aggressive in collecting legitimate debts, but the prosecution produced emails where Patricia had explicitly discussed targeting properties that were unlikely to respond to notices and perfect for quick turnover. I testified about my experience, as did Dorothy Chen and several other victims. One man, a veteran named Carl Rodriguez, testified that he'd lost a 20-acre parcel his father had left him. He'd only found out about the foreclosure when he tried to visit the property and found it had been subdivided and sold to developers. He broke down crying on the stand, and I saw several jurors wipe their eyes. The most damning evidence came from Patricia's own records. She'd kept meticulous notes about which properties to target, how to structure the foreclosure notices to make them technically legal while ensuring owners wouldn't actually receive them, and how much profit she expected from each sale. She'd even referred to it as the system in emails to her accountant. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. They found Patricia Carmichael guilty on all counts: 14 counts of fraud, 14 counts of theft, 7 counts of forgery, and 1 count of operating a criminal enterprise. At sentencing 6 weeks later, Judge Reeves showed no mercy. Miss Carmichael, you systematically exploited your position of trust to steal from vulnerable people. You targeted retirees, veterans, and working families. You showed no remorse and no conscience. You treated people's homes and property as nothing more than commodities to be stolen and resold for profit. Patricia stood silently, her expensive attorney beside her. She'd aged visibly over the months since her arrest, her blonde bob now showing gray roots and her face drawn. I'm sentencing you to 18 years in the Montana State Prison, with no possibility of parole for the first 8 years. Additionally, you are ordered to pay full restitution to all victims, totaling $2.3 million. Your assets, including all properties acquired through fraudulent means, are hereby forfeited to the state and will be liquidated to pay restitution. Patricia's composure finally cracked. She started crying, but Judge Reeves continued without pause. I want this sentence to send a clear message. HOA boards have real power over people's lives. That power must be exercised ethically and legally. When someone abuses that power for personal gain, they will be held accountable to the fullest extent of the law. Patricia was led away in handcuffs. Her attorney filed an appeal, but it was denied 3 months later. She would spend the next decade and a half in prison. The aftermath took over a year to fully resolve. The legitimate Pine Valley HOA, under new management after Patricia's arrest, voluntarily released all the properties that had been fraudulently added to its jurisdiction. They issued public apologies to all the victims and established new procedures to prevent similar abuses. The Hendersons got their $60,000 back from the liquidation of Patricia's assets, plus an additional $20,000 in damages. Derek called me to say thank you and told me they'd bought a house in town that they actually liked better than the cabin. Dorothy Chen got her lot back, along with compensation for its increased value over the years she'd been deprived of it. Carl Rodriguez got his father's 20 acres returned, though the part that had been subdivided required a lengthy legal battle with the developers who'd bought it in good faith. I spent 2 weeks that fall at the cabin, fixing it up and trying to reconnect with the memories I'd made there with my grandfather. I replaced the locks, repaired some damage from the various occupants, and spent long evenings sitting on the porch watching the sun set over the mountains. One evening, Martin drove up to visit me. We sat on the porch drinking beer while the sky turned pink and orange. "You know, you could have settled this case early on," Martin said. "The HOA's insurance company offered you $100,000 to go away quietly. You spent more than that fighting this." "It wasn't about the money," I said. "It was about what was right. Patricia was stealing from people who couldn't fight back. If I'd taken the settlement, she'd still be doing it. You saved a lot of people a lot of pain." Dorothy Chen told me she drives by her lot every week now just to remind herself she owns it again. Carl is planning to build a house on his father's land for his daughter. Good, that's what matters. What are you going to do with the cabin? I looked out at the forest, the creek bubbling in the distance, the mountains rising against the darkening sky. I'm going to keep it, use it. Maybe bring my kids here someday like Grandpa brought me. This place has too much history to let it go. Martin raised his beer bottle. To your grandfather, he built something worth fighting for. To Grandpa, I echoed, clinking bottles with him. The legal bills ended up totaling nearly $90,000, which I paid from my savings and a loan against my house in Denver. It was worth every penny. Not just because I got the cabin back, but because Patricia Carmichael would never steal from anyone again. The following spring, I visited Patricia in prison. I didn't owe her anything, but I wanted to understand what had driven her to destroy so many lives. She looked smaller in prison orange, her hair cut short and her face bare of makeup. We sat across from each other in the visitor's room, separated by a plexiglass barrier. "Why?" I asked. "You had a steady job managing a legitimate HOA. Why turn it into a criminal enterprise?" Patricia was quiet for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was flat. "It started small. There was a property that genuinely owed dues, but the owner had moved out of state and wasn't responding to notices. The board authorized a foreclosure and I handled the paperwork. When it sold at auction for less than it was worth, I thought about how easy it would be to buy it myself and flip it. So you did." "I did. Made $40,000 in profit. No one questioned it. No one even noticed, so I did it again. Found another property with a genuinely delinquent account and bought it at auction through my husband's LLC. Made another $50,000. And then you couldn't stop. The money was addictive, And it was so easy. I knew exactly how to structure the paperwork to make it look legal. I knew which properties were vulnerable because they were vacation places or investment lots that owners didn't check regularly. I told myself I wasn't really hurting anyone because they'd get the money from the auction. Except you were paying yourself a fraction of what the properties were worth. I justified it by saying they shouldn't have let the properties get delinquent in the first place. They shouldn't have ignored the notices. She looked up at me and I saw no real remorse in her eyes, just resignation. The truth is, I liked feeling smart, powerful. Like I'd figured out a loophole everyone else was too dumb to see. Until you got caught. Until I got caught, she agreed. For what it's worth, I am sorry about your cabin. Your grandfather's property was never actually part of the HOA, I knew that. But it was such a perfect piece of land, and I knew I could get at least $200,000 for it. The temptation was too strong. You destroyed people's lives for money. I know, I'll have a long time to think about that. I left the prison feeling hollow. There was no satisfaction in seeing Patricia behind bars, no sense of justice served. Just sadness that someone had been willing to hurt so many people for greed, but life moved on. The cabin became my refuge again, the place I went when I needed to clear my head or remember who I was beneath all the stress of daily life. I brought my girlfriend there the following summer, and she fell in love with it just like I'd hoped she would. 2 years after Patricia's conviction, on a clear October morning, I stood on the cabin's porch with that same girlfriend, now my fiancée, and realized how close I'd come to losing this place forever. If I'd been less stubborn, if Martin had been less determined, if Judge Reeves had been less thorough, Patricia's scheme would have succeeded. "What are you thinking about?" my fiancée asked, wrapping her arms around me from behind. How lucky I am, and how many people weren't as lucky. But you made them lucky too. By fighting back, you saved all those other properties. I guess. It just seems wrong that it took someone with resources and time to fight back before anyone paid attention to what was happening. That's why it matters that you did fight. You showed everyone else they could too. She was right. In the 2 years since Patricia's conviction, 3 other fraudulent HOA schemes had been uncovered in Montana alone, all revealed when victims came forward inspired by the publicity around Patricia's case. One was in Bozeman, another in Kalispell, and a third in Great Falls. In each case, HOA board members had been abusing their authority for personal gain, and in each case they were now facing criminal charges. The Montana legislature had even passed new laws strengthening property owner protections and requiring HOAs to maintain transparent financial records. They called it the Wheeler Protection Act, which was simultaneously flattering and uncomfortable. I didn't set out to change any laws. I just wanted my grandfather's cabin back. But I testified before the state legislature when they were considering the bill, telling my story and explaining how easy it had been for Patricia to manipulate the system. Other victims testified too, creating a powerful narrative about the need for reform. The day the bill passed, Dorothy Chen called me, crying with joy. They said my name on the floor. They said what happened to me was why this law was necessary. For the first time since I lost my property, I feel like what I went through mattered. It did matter, I told her. It all mattered. Every person who came forward, every story that was told, it all added up to change. Looking back on the whole ordeal, from finding strangers in my cabin to watching Patricia led away in handcuffs to standing in the state capitol as a new law was signed, I realized something important. The cabin itself, as much as I loved it, wasn't really what I'd been fighting for. I'd been fighting for the principle that you can't just take what belongs to someone else because you have power and they don't. My grandfather had built that cabin as a young man, planning a life with my grandmother. They'd spent 30 summers there together before she died. After her death, he'd bring me there every year, teaching me to fish and chop wood and appreciate the silence of the wilderness. He'd poured his life into that place, and when he left it to me, he was trusting me to protect it. I'd nearly failed that trust. But in the end, with the help of good people like Martin and Judge Reeves and Lisa Navarro, I'd succeeded. The cabin was mine again, free and clear, with no fraudulent HOA claiming authority over it. The following year, my fiancé and I got married at the cabin. We stood by the creek where my grandfather had taught me to fish, surrounded by family and friends, and promised to build a life together. Martin was there, as was Dorothy Chen and several other people who'd been affected by Patricia's crimes. It felt right to celebrate something good in a place that had been at the center of so much conflict. During the reception, Dorothy pulled me aside. "I have something to tell you. I sold my lot last month, got a fair price for it too. But I wouldn't have been able to do that if you hadn't fought for your cabin. You gave me my property back, and that property gave me the financial security I needed to retire comfortably. So thank you, James. Thank you for not giving up. You would have done the same thing," I said. "No, I wouldn't have. I proved that when I walked away instead of fighting, but you didn't walk away, and that made all the difference." As the sun set over the mountains and my new wife laughed with her family and friends, I thought about all the ways life had changed since that morning when I'd walked into the cabin and found strangers at my grandfather's table. I'd learned that the law, when properly applied, really could protect the innocent and punish the guilty. I'd learned that fighting back, even when it seemed hopeless, could make a difference. And I'd learned that some things, like family and justice and the Montana wilderness, were worth any cost to protect. Patricia Carmichael spent her first years in prison filing appeals and claiming she'd been treated unfairly. Every appeal was denied. Eventually, according to news reports, she'd stopped filing motions and accepted her sentence. She'd be eligible for parole in 2031, at which point she'd be 70 years old. Even if released, she'd be forbidden from ever serving on an HOA board or handling other people's property. Her husband divorced her 6 months after her conviction, claiming he'd known nothing about her schemes. The evidence suggested he was telling the truth. He'd been a passive participant in the shell company purchases, signing documents his wife put in front of him without reading them carefully. He cooperated fully with investigators and was never charged with any crimes. The legitimate Pine Valley HOA survived the scandal, though it took years to rebuild its reputation. They elected an entirely new board, hired an independent management company, and instituted strict oversight procedures. Property values in the development actually increased after Patricia's arrest, as buyers felt more confident they were purchasing in a community with ethical leadership. One unexpected consequence of the case was that I became an accidental activist for HOA reform. I gave interviews to news outlets, spoke at community forums, and even testified before Congress when they held hearings on HOA abuses. I never sought out that role, but once people knew my story, they kept asking me to share it. The most rewarding part was hearing from other victims who'd found the courage to fight back after hearing what happened in my case. A man in Nevada successfully sued his HOA for wrongfully foreclosing on his house over a disputed $20 fine. A woman in Arizona exposed an HOA board member who'd been embezzling dues for personal vacations. A family in Oregon prevented their HOA from foreclosing by presenting evidence, inspired by my case, that proved the HOA had manipulated their account. Each of those victories felt personal, like another vindication of the choice I'd made to fight instead of walking away. 5 years after Patricia's conviction, I was back at the cabin for my annual 2-week stay. My wife was pregnant with our first child, and we'd spent the days planning how we'd eventually bring our son or daughter to this place, continuing the tradition my grandfather had started. One afternoon, a truck pulled up the long driveway. I didn't recognize the vehicle, so I stepped out onto the porch with a mixture of curiosity and caution. An elderly man climbed out, moving slowly but steadily. "Are you James Wheeler?" he called. "I am. Can I help you?" "I hope so. My name is Frank Morrison. I owned a cabin about 2 miles from here, up near Copper Creek. Patricia Carmichael stole it from me in 2020. After she went to prison and they liquidated her assets, I got some money back, but my cabin had already been sold to someone else and I couldn't get it back. I'm sorry. That must have been devastating. It was, but I wanted to thank you. Because you fought back, I at least got some compensation. Without your case, I'd have gotten nothing. I used that money to buy a little place in town, not the same as my cabin, but it's home. I'm glad something good came out of it for you. Frank looked around at the forest, the mountains, the creek. This is beautiful land. Your grandfather had good taste. He did. You fought for him, for his legacy. That means something. Frank extended his hand and I shook it. I just wanted you to know it meant something to me too. After Frank left, I sat on the porch for a long time, thinking about all the lives that had been touched by Patricia's crimes and the long process of bringing her to justice. It wasn't just about me or my cabin. It was about Frank Morrison and Dorothy Chen and Carl Rodriguez, and a dozen other people whose names I'd never know but whose lives had been upended by one person's greed. The justice system, for all its flaws, had worked. Patricia was in prison. The victims had received compensation. The laws had been changed to prevent similar abuses. It wasn't perfect, nothing ever is, but it was something. It was proof that fighting back could make a difference. My wife stepped out onto the porch, her hand resting on her growing belly. Who was that? Another person Patricia hurt. He wanted to say thank you. You saved a lot of people, you know that. I just wanted my cabin back. But in getting your cabin back, you exposed a criminal and changed the system. That's not nothing, James, that's everything. She was right. I'd set out to reclaim my inheritance, but I'd ended up part of something much larger. A movement to hold HOAs accountable, to protect property owners from abuse, to ensure that power couldn't be wielded without oversight. As the sun set that evening, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple, I thought about my grandfather. He'd built this cabin as a sanctuary, a place away from the complications of the world. But sometimes, the world finds you no matter where you hide. And when it does, you have a choice. Fight back or let it roll over you. I'd chosen to fight, and that choice had rippled outward in ways I never could have imagined. Patricia Carmichael was behind bars. 14 families had gotten justice. Montana had new laws protecting property owners. And my grandfather's cabin still stood in the wilderness, a testament to the value of stubborn resistance against injustice. The cabin would be here for my child, and someday for my grandchildren. They'd learn to fish in the same creek where I'd learned, walk the same trails, watch the same mountains turn pink in the evening light. And maybe, when they were old enough, I'd tell them the story of how their father almost lost it all, and how he fought to get it back. Not because he was particularly brave or special, but because some things are worth fighting for. Family, justice, the belief that right should triumph over wrong. Those principles are timeless, and they matter just as much in a remote Montana cabin as they do anywhere else in the world. Patricia Carmichael had thought she could steal those principles along with the property. She'd thought her position gave her the right to take what wasn't hers. She'd been wrong, and now she was paying the price. As for me, I'd learned lessons I'd carry for the rest of my life. I'd learned that standing up to injustice is hard and expensive and sometimes seems impossible. But I'd also learned that it's necessary. Because if people like me, who have resources and time and support, don't fight back, then people like Frank Morrison and Dorothy Chen, who have less, have no chance at all. The Montana wilderness stretched out before me, unchanged by human drama, indifferent to property lines and legal battles. But the cabin, my grandfather's cabin, my cabin, stood as proof that sometimes, just sometimes, justice prevails. And that was a legacy worth preserving.